Fun, great to if you're new to the community, welcome, and lots of familiar faces and some new faces or names. And so feel free to just jump in the chat also if you're new, to just say where you're from. And apologies again for the dog that seems to appear in everything that I do these days. So I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with Jonathan Malesic this evening, and we first encountered Jonathan's work in an op-ed where he was speaking about the nature of work and burnout, which, of course, as Julie just referenced, is been kind of the big question about how do we live in a year of Shemitah, of this sabbatical year, when as also Jews, we have many religions, of course, have a Sabbath, but we have a very regulated existence of the distinction between work and rest. But we do a very bad job of making those distinctions. And that has enormous impact on spiritual life, on our bodies, on so many things, and of course, on our culture. And then we reached out, Julie actually reached out to Jonathan to say, hey, would you come talk to our community? And Jonathan and I spoke a number of weeks ago. And since I've been reading the book, I feel like I've been channeling him in my head and asking a lot of questions really about kind of the lives we lead and the nature of our self-identity. So we're totally excited. I'm totally excited to have this conversation with Jonathan tonight. Jonathan is based in Dallas. He's a writer and a former academic, and we'll hear a little bit more about his story. A sushi chef and a parking lot attendant. He holds a PhD from the University of Virginia, and his work has appeared in a lot of places that we know: the New York Times, the New Republic, the New York Times Magazine, Washington Post, amongst others. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Felicia. It is an honor to be here with you, and yeah, thanks to Shuli for inviting me, and this is a wonderful turnout. It's great to see so many people here.
Great. So I wanted to start, and you basically start the book off with your own story. And there's a moment where you speak about your life as a student in college and having this professor that you love deeply and kind of sitting at his feet, and that a number of students would kind of in the lounge, I think it is, that the professor is kind of pontificating and students are engaged, and it was kind of the dream of your life to kind of be in that space. And that was the ideal that you had imagined for yourself in that moment, that's what you wanted to be. And then you ended up becoming that, and all things fell apart. So bring us from that moment of, in a little bit of a fast forward way, that moment of the dream feeling so palpable and real as a student. And then what happened to you when you became that tenured track professor at a small college?
Yeah, exactly. I had, from about the time I met my first college professors, I knew that I wanted to be one of them. Looking back, I now realize how little of their lives I actually knew, but what they presented to me as a student seemed to me like just the good life. It was the life of the mind. It was a life of learning and wisdom and art and all this great stuff. And so I did the things that you need to do to get that life, and then I got my shot to do it. I started a tenure track position teaching theology at a small Catholic college in Northeast Pennsylvania. And I really merged my identity with the job. I was working probably sort of long hours, but it wasn't so much the long hours that were critical to my living out the dream job and my hyper identification with the job. It was simply that I was a college professor in every sense. I wore tweed everywhere I went. And So I tried to live out those ideals that I believed I had seen all those years before. And, sometimes things went pretty well. But well, I guess the pinnacle of my career was, getting tenure and then spending years sabbatical in the Berkshires, writing in the mornings and bicycling in the afternoons. It was totally glorious. And what I was working on at that time, because one of my key interests academically were the moral and spiritual questions that come up through our work lives. So I was researching and writing about that. Well, then I came back to the college and I once again threw myself into my work, but it felt very different. It started not to feel like a dream so much anymore. I started to feel strange, inexplicable pains in my torso that physicians, couldn't find anything medically wrong. I started to have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning. I had a hard time planning for my classes. And I grew increasingly frustrated with my colleagues, with my students, and I felt less and less effective. I looked out at my classroom, and just saw all these blank faces and felt like I wasn't teaching them anything. And I had no idea what was wrong with me. And I assumed that there was something wrong with me. I took antidepressants for a while. I went through talk therapy for a while. Neither of those really seemed to solve the problem. I even took a semester of unpaid leave just to get away from the college, hoping that the rest would at least cure my exhaustion and my frustration. After that, 5 months away, I came back to the college, and the problem picked up exactly where it left off. And ultimately, the only answer was to quit. Fortunately, my wife, who is also an academic, got a job offer here in Dallas, and so I followed her here. And in the weeks after my decision to quit, I started to encounter research on burnout. And being a nerd at heart, I tried to understand my own personal experience in terms of that research. So what were psychologists saying about burnout? And it started to it started to make sense of what had happened to me. And in the months and years following that, I connected that research to my own experience, and also those old questions that I had been pursuing, the ways that work raises questions of meaning and morality and purpose in our lives. And so that's kind of been my project for the last several years, and the book is the result of all of that.
Thank you. Awesome. So one of the things I think that you speak about is that there's a lot of talk about burnout, but no one knows what it actually is. Like, there's not a clear definition. And so when there's not a clear definition, it's like being spoken about as if everything is burnout, or if everything is burnout, nothing is burnout. And so tell us, how do you actually define burnout?
Right. So I define burnout as the experience of being chronically stretched between your ideals for work and the reality of your job. So we come to work with expectations, not just of a salary and benefits and schedule and those very concrete things, but really abstract things too. As I went looking for the good life in my job as a college professor, or we might look for purpose. We might work to fulfill a calling. We might work to prove our character or something like that. So all of those are the ideals that we bring. And then those encounter the reality of our job, what it's actually like to do that. And so I like to think of burnout as being as trying to walk on a pair of stilts. If one of the stilts is your ideals for work and the other is the reality of your job, if they're pretty well aligned, then at least in principle, you can move forward. But once they get out of alignment, it becomes more difficult, and you're just scrambling to stay upright. You might hold on to one and lose the other. You might fall completely on your face and injure yourself. So that's the kind of broad definition of burnout. And the way that psychologists in the research measure that is along three dimensions. There are three components: exhaustion, which I think many of us are familiar with; cynicism, which is like me getting frustrated with my students. It's when you start to be visibly frustrated or angry, or put emotional distance between yourself and the people you work with. And the third component is a sense of ineffectiveness. So in my case, it's feeling like my students are not learning anything from me. And so there's no official diagnosis for burnout in the United States, but at least in the research literature, people who score high on those three dimensions of exhaustion, cynicism, and ineffectiveness are, they fit the classical definition of burnout.
Great. So I want to go back to what you said about the distant, the stilts metaphor, or I feel like it also Parker Palmer speaks about like the tragic gap between ideals and reality. It has a similar quality to it, although I think he has a perspective that that's a sustained experience, like that we live always in a tragic gap. And in some way, I think your point is that the distance is the burnout, like that's where it lives in that distance. And I, and you point in the book to kind of the turning point in the 70s when, things start to get a little out of balance in terms of just life in the United States and the productivity in relation for workers in relationship to wages. And I am thinking about kind of the story of my own parents who, I was born in the early 70s, so they were already in working lives at that time. And the sense was like that they got jobs to have jobs, to live a life. In a sense, they didn't think to themselves, like my brother and I, what do I want to do? Like, what do I love? My brother is a poet and my, a literature professor, and I'm a rabbi. So, that's not where necessarily is like, it was really about calling. And so I think one of the interesting questions is like, in some way, the privilege of being able to ask some of those bigger questions has the biggest, you could say, it has the biggest opportunity to be in the gap when you have lesser expectations in a sense that you're going to be fulfilled, then you're not walking in that gap sense, in that dreamy sense. So could you talk a little bit about both the historic kind of evolution, a little bit of some of why the 70s is a turning point and some of the ways work is talked about, and then kind of what it means to feel vocational in that sense, and kind of the concern about it in a certain way.
Yeah, well, and this gets at like the ambivalence of vocation, which and ideals for work, which maybe we can talk some more about. But yeah, I mean, you and I are of the same generation, and perhaps our parents are from parallel generations too. And I use this as the epigram to the book. My father, when any of the kids would complain about work or something like that, he would say, "You don't have to like it. That's why it's called work." And he was born. He was born in 1933, so he was born during the Great Depression, and had, I think, in his career, he did not expect fulfillment in his career. I did, born in 1975. And yeah, I mean, the key change, I think, is in the post-war boom. it was sort of like the tail end or the heyday of the manufacturing economy. And that historians now see a real watershed in 1973 or 1974 when that boom ended. And several things happened. So one thing is that we started to shift from an economy that is primarily driven by manufacturing to one primarily driven by services. And in service industries, the means of production are very often your personality, your facial expressions, your emotions. And so in that sense, work began to take over more of a person's self, we could say. So more of who you are is at stake in your work. Simultaneously, the 1970s was a period when labor unions began to lose their power and workers began to lose a lot of protections. Work became more precarious on the whole. As you mentioned, like wages started to flatline in real terms, especially relative to productivity. And it was at that, and also at that time, also with the shift to the service economy is the ideals for work culturally began to rise. I think, backing up even a few years before that, I believe it was 1963, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Friedan wrote that in the post-war boom, we had solved the problem of productivity. We had inaugurated an abundant society. And so now the question of work was not productivity, but meaning. And that idea began to take greater and greater hold in the culture throughout the 70s and beyond. And so at that time, our ideals for work are higher than ever. We're working for meaning, but the conditions in which we work don't improve on the whole for workers. So culturally speaking, the gap has grown. And it's at that time that burnout appears in the research literature, probably drawn from workers themselves. So poverty attorneys, free clinic volunteers at the St. Mark's Free Clinic downtown, and counselors, teachers, people like that, people who were working very closely trying to meet just this massive societal need. They were the ones in whom burnout was first identified. And the first researchers on burnout, Christina Maslach on the West Coast and Herbert Freudenberger in the East, they theorized burnout and published the first papers on it at almost the exact same time, but working independently in 1974 or so. And also people like Bob Dylan were singing about burnout. Neil Young mentions burnout in a 1974 song. So there's something was in the air. And I think it had to do with that growing gap between our ideals and the reality of work.
Great. So one of the ironies, and I feel like I live in a lot of this space, and I suppose many of us do, is that on the one hand, burnout is something that's bad. On the other hand, burnout is like a badge of honor. And, I think you speak in the book about kind of the martyrdom around work. And, it's like we don't want to be burned out, but actually, if we burn out, it speaks to kind of how we're just like so over the top in our work, which is our identity. And so it has this kind of oxymoronic quality. And could you speak to that? And I mean, just to go back to kind of, you're a theology professor. So besides the psychology that is like the kind of moral crisis of spirit that you think that's about, and what is the culture telling us about work that makes it this oxymoronic quality, burnout, and both a deeply depressing experience while also being a badge of honor.
Yeah, that badge of honor thing that's the other aspect of burnout culture, is that it's not just that we live in these conditions that encourage us to burn out, but we kind of welcome it, because if you have burned out, then you must have been an ideal worker. You must have worked very, very hard and sacrificed for your job, which in our culture is, brings you status. It's esteemed. Everyone wants to claim to be a hard worker. There's very little pride in being lazy in our culture. And yeah, I mean, theologically, I sort of look at things often I see theological patterns often in secular, ostensibly secular contexts. And so, for instance, like I see our interest in work very much reflecting, the Protestant work ethic, which I think applies, regardless of, in the United States, you certainly don't have to be Protestant to embody that ethic. I'm Roman Catholic and I feel it very much. But because the core thing that is that at the heart of the Protestant ethic is anxiety. And it's anxiety about status. It's anxiety, if you think about it in strictly theological terms, it's, the Calvinists of the 16th and 17th century believed that God predestined people to, to their salvation or damnation. Nothing anyone can do about it, but we understandably want to know. And so to deal with that anxiety, you work as hard as you possibly can to prove that you are, building God's kingdom. And, that anxiety has persisted even as the theological beliefs have gone away. So we still, Americans of all religious backgrounds, have a kind of anxiety about our status. Are we hard workers? Are we talented? Are we partner material? Are we, are we good people? All that matters to us. And we want to prove to ourselves that we are. And so we work and work and work to convince ourselves of that status. But that's what leads us right into the jaws of that gap between ideal and reality. In fact, that desire to prove to ourselves makes us persist, I think, in conditions that are likely to burn us out.
So a question came in about kind of the challenge of, and that on the one hand, like that's a drive, that's an internal spiritual drive, and it's also a cultural, it's the cultural milieu that we're living in. And who's responsible for burnout in a sense, because the question is really about, like, is it a blame the victim scenario? Like, if you get burned out, it's your fault because you don't have boundaries. And, there's a lot of, and, we have a big staff at BJ, at least bigger than a lot of synagogues. And we think a lot about, like, what is the culture? And, we're in a service, is a vocational community, and, like, how do you create boundaries? What's wellness? But when does wellness become entitlement? Like, there are lots of things. And so how do you, think about what is the responsibility of the individual to their own health and well-being? And then on the other hand, what are the ways that society has to own that? I mean, you've pointed some of the diagnosis, but, like, what do we have to own as individuals, and what is more societal?
Yeah, if you read a lot of, there's a lot published about burnout right now. A lot of, 5 tips for beating burnout and things like that. And I think there is an implicit, there can be an implicit victim blaming in that advice, because it suggests that, well, you can solve your burnout yourself. Just do these things, create boundaries, learn to say no, don't answer email after whatever time. And I don't think those things really work, is what it comes down to, because the causes of burnout are not primarily in the individual. They certainly, like, the individual is involved. The individual is caught between the ideals and reality. But the reality of your work is rarely determined solely by you. It's almost always determined by others, employers, clients, customers, and so on. And so you don't have a total say over the conditions you work in. You also don't have a total say over the ideals you bring to work, because those ideals are shared. Those ideals are in the culture. They're usually not, if you ask 100 people, you're not going to come up with 100 different ideals for work. You might come up with like 5, because we grow up in the same culture and we bring those ideals to our work. And it's those things outside of the self, or at least shared between the self, the workplace, and the culture, they're the causes of burnout. And so those have to be the sites of the solution to burnout. So yeah, I don't want to blame the victim. I want to blame the culture. I want to blame the workplaces primarily.
So say a little bit more about how you would imagine addressing culturally the issues of burnout that are endemic to our society.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is just, well, it's not a small thing, but like shifting our ideals for work, shifting what we believe work is meant to do for us, and maybe getting back to the ideals of my parents' generation. Perhaps not entirely, baked into those ideals is, a lot of sexism, for one thing, with the ideal of the male breadwinner, but with the idea that work doesn't have to completely fulfill you. We need fulfillment. We crave fulfillment, but work doesn't have to be that primary site for it. Work should be a place where our dignity is honored. Work should be a place where we can do good things for our community, but it should be more of a platform for us to pursue the good life, rather than an end in itself, rather than the main vehicle for the good life. So that's pretty abstract. And I think that the way to shift that is to have conversations with each other in our communities, our religious communities, our workplaces, and so on, about our ideals for work, because that's ultimately what culture is. It's talking about stuff with other people and coming to, generating new ideas that can be shared.
Great. So I want to go back to your own story. And we spoke about this in our little early conversation. For me, and given that it's Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, like, it's very striking to me that it was at the sabbatical moment of your return that you realized things hadn't changed, and so one of the questions, but it's not necessarily, at least how you tell the story, it's not like the sabbatical was the insight to, it was like another existence, and then you were returning back to what was before. And in some way, I think from a religious point of view, from a biblical or a rabbinic perspective, the sabbatical year is a re-envisioning, right? It's kind of a detox from the structures and hierarchies of the way society is structured, to say, let's revisit our assumptions. And, both in terms of the poor, because there was the debt release, which is in Deuteronomy, both in terms of our relationship to the land, with letting the land lie fallow. And obviously at the core of that is functioning from a place of faith, that the good life is actually not built around all the structures, but the good life is built around faith. So I'd love you to reflect on what you learned in the sabbatical year, and what do you think its function ultimately? Professors get sabbaticals all the time, right? Like that. I mean, all the time. I don't know. But there's the notion of sabbatical, and really, because in some way you could say, if potentially it could be a cultural norm, that could help create a different conversation around the nature of work, right? And I would so I'm curious, around you thinking about your own sabbatical and its meaning, and what kind of stirred your soul in that way, which impacted the return in such profundity in a certain sense. And then the function of kind of isolated time, which could be Sabbath, on a weekly basis, or sabbatical on a 7-year structure, like the notion of stopping function in traditional structures that whether in whatever form of pattern that takes.
Right. I mean, the thing in academia is that everyone, when they go on sabbatical, what they say is, well, now I'll get to do my own work, right? No one, and what that means is you don't have to respond to students for the most part. You don't have committee meetings and stuff like that. And often you get to go away somewhere, but you're still working, and there's an expectation that you will be working. But the schedule is freer, right? And you can kind of set it yourself. And when, if ever, you have to report on your sabbatical, perhaps to your dean or to a granting agency or something like that, what you have to tell them is what work you did, how productive were you in this time away from your ordinary job. The answer is the right answer to that question, what did you do on sabbatical, is not well, I transformed my vision of the role that work should play in my life, right? That sense of sabbatical and the Shemitah sense of sabbatical are very different. And yeah, I mean, in my case, when I took my my paid sabbatical, like I said before, it was great because I got to do the work I most wanted to do. I could do it at a reasonable pace, and I only had to do it a few hours a day, and I could read, ride a bike, go hiking, hang out and drink coffee, all I wanted. And then I came back, and I didn't take away I didn't take away a lesson from that about how I should be working, even though what I was doing, the work I was doing on sabbatical was trying to make an argument that we should change our approach to work. I couldn't even convince myself of that. I mean, and the fact is, I couldn't change the reality of my job. I still had, my teaching obligations hadn't changed, and certainly my ideals for the job hadn't changed. And then when I took the unpaid leave and came back, it's no wonder my burnout picked up right where it left off, because nothing about my job had changed. So I wish that I'd had this conversation a decade ago. Things might have gone differently on that sabbatical, because I went into it. I didn't think that it would be something that would transform my approach to work. It didn't enter into my mind that that might happen, which again is ironic considering the project I was working on.
Right, right. So in the introduction to the book, you speak about the nature of the pandemic and how, as opposed to a sabbatical, which is a designated time with the beginning and an end and a project of work, if you're in academia, to do something specific without the regular kind of demands. The pandemic has kind of forced a different hand around thinking about work. And you describe it really as an opportunity, really to not go back in a way, and to take the learnings, of which there's been a lot of conversation about the Great Resignation, or the kind of what needs to be in the office, who needs to be in the office, who doesn't, what we in our own staff team did a bunch of looking into, like, what do people need to be in person for, and what is the nature of the relationships that people need to build in work culture that is valued, while also honoring the dignity of people to not have to commute 2 hours a week, 2 hours a day, and what that does to the soul, all those kinds of things. So could you speak a little bit more about kind of the role that you feel that the pandemic has played around these questions, and some of your, obviously, I just want to say this pandemic has been deeply devastating, right? So many lives have been lost, and a lot of suffering, a lot of mental health suffering, a lot of physical suffering, and grief. And we don't even necessarily know what that is yet. But I think it's also raised a lot of questions also about the assumptions that we've been living in. So could you speak to kind of the intersection about this conversation with the pandemic?
Yeah, a sabbatical is supposed to be nice, right? It's a break from, and not like a break like a coffee break, but like a some kind of break from the routine. And of course, the pandemic has been anything but nice. But it has been, it has been a rat, especially early on in our working lives. It was a radical break. It was a total rupture of the way that everything had worked up to that point. And I think that, when things break down, they reveal something of their nature. Your car breaks down, and you see the car in a new way, and you have an opportunity to realize, like, at the core, like, well, how does this thing work? And I think that's been the case with the pandemic. One thing that was revealed is how much our society depends on the labor of people who are often the lowest paid and the least secure in their employment. We can't, society doesn't last one day without their labor. And right, it's also, it has caused us, I think, usefully to question those assumptions. And there's a push to sort of go back to normal, and that normal will surely be somewhat transformed. But I think that in the scheme of things, considering the kind of rupture that the pandemic represented in our working lives and in all other aspects of our lives, I don't think that it could be years, it could be decades before we kind of sort out what it meant for our working lives. We may in some ways go back to normal and say, wait a minute, no, I don't want that. Like, we're going to do things differently now. Partly out of a recognition that, the great loss of life has meant, wow, our lives are much more fragile than we perhaps realized. And, are we spending them in the best way? Are we spending them in the way we really want? If we are commuting for 90 minutes a day and so on. So yeah, I mean, the American work ethic was built up over decades and centuries, and it's not going to change radically in 2 years. It's going to take decades. It could take centuries for a new vision of the role of work in a good life to take hold. But it would take, if it's ever going to change, the kind of thing we have just been through is probably what it would take, like that kind of radical rupture that causes us to look at our lives in a new way.
Yeah. We had at the launch lecture, the launch conversation around the Shemitah year, we had Professor Lori Zoloff, and he speaks about the theology of disruption when it comes to the sabbatical year. And like in many ways, I think like sabbatical is biblically, it's not a choice disruption, but a sabbatical for an academic is a chosen. This has been, as you speak about rupture, it's like an unchosen rupture, and kind of the kind of underlying exposure that gets awakened. And I think one of the deeper questions is, are we willing to really look it in the eye? Are we really willing to kind of honestly look at what has been exposed and then confront it or learn from it, or which is not necessarily the way we function as a society, to take it slow enough to actually do the learning. So I want to go back. Someone wrote in the chat that she feels resistant to the idea that work shouldn't be fulfilling, and this is one of the things that I've been thinking about. Obviously, as a rabbi, I consider it a vocation, and so how do you balance kind of the desire for fulfillment without it becoming the entirety of your identity? Like how do you kind of hold the nature of people also feeling purposeful in their work, and what's the limit to that?
Yeah, and I also very, like, on an existential level, deal with that same tension. I guess that, yeah, my point is not to say that, work shouldn't have any meaning, right? Or it shouldn't ever be fulfilling. Work should be, better on average than it is now. Like it should be, yeah, I guess what I want to say is I don't want to just say, work isn't fulfilling, work shouldn't be fulfilling, so who cares what happens there. So that's one kind of extreme I want to guard against. I guess that it's a matter of kind of taking the ideals down somewhat. Like our ideals are way up here. And I think that we could just stand to lower them a bit, out of, a recognition of the fact that, vocation is a little bit risky. That I guess maybe it's like, I don't know, hedging our bets a bit, and looking for meaning, looking for fulfillment in a range of places, in a range of ways, and partly out of a recognition of the fact that the day is coming for all of us when we won't be able to do the work that we love anymore. Any of a number of things can happen, and we're all facing one day retirement. We're facing a disability. We're facing changes in our the economy and our industry and all of that. And I think that's keeping that in mind can maybe get us to place kind of more bets on meaning and not put them all or so many of them onto work. So it's like just balance things a little differently, maybe.
Great. So there's a question about generationally, like there's a lot of talk about millennials. One of the questions asked about how millennials saw burnout of their parents, but also in the book, you speak specifically about kind of the millennial generation, which, uses burnout in very loosely, you could say. I think that was, I don't know, that was certainly not the term you used in the book. So and also something you address in the book is also about on the questions how race impact and if there enough research has been done. So can you speak to kind of just a little bit of like a window into the analysis about the differentials around impact or understanding is or is not yet clear about how different generations think about burnout?
Yeah, so when I first started, if I had an idea of burnout a decade or more ago, I imagined someone at the tail end of their career, limping to the finish line or something like that. And then, of course, I was not quite 40 when I underwent burnout. And so that forced me to revise what I was thinking. And at some point along the way, like millennial generation burnout became a much discussed topic. And, the person who literally wrote the book on it, Anne Helen Peterson, the journalist, made the case that millennials have had, very challenging, like the economic conditions of their education and their working lives have been pretty bad compared to older generations. And thus that's why they have this pervasive feeling of burnout. And when I first read that, I was like, oh, wait till you turn 40, youngsters, then you'll really feel burnout, right? And the more I researched on this, I realized that it often is younger workers or earlier career workers who are most susceptible to burnout. And a reason for that is often early in your career, you have extremely high ideals. You want to make a difference. You've been planning this career for a long time, and now you got your start. And often at the same time, you're making the least you will ever make. You get the worst assignments, and so it's no wonder that earlier career workers are susceptible to burnout. The gap is very wide for them, and in some cases they will leave that career and go into a different one that may turn out to be more sustainable. And so older workers, workers who are further along in their career are the ones who've survived in that career without burnout and have found a way to keep going, and without exhaustion, cynicism, and ineffectiveness. So that's maybe one reason why we see burnout showing up in earlier career workers. And I think that Peterson's book, what it's really good at is identifying how millennials were how those ideals for work were inculcated in them, and then how they met that reality. As far as like race and gender goes, we'll start with gender. I mean, the research is not totally consistent, but there's generally, women exhibit, more signs of burnout or are, basically score higher on average on burnout measures than men. The difference is not massive, but it's significant, like statistically significant, right? It's there. By one measure, female physicians are at about 33% greater risk of burnout than their male colleagues. And when it comes to race, there's way more, there's quite a bit of research on gender as a factor in burnout. There's not much research on race as a factor in burnout. And what research there is doesn't show big differences. That's, I mean, probably more research needs to be done to kind of, pin down, the mechanisms, the ways that burnout interacts with, societal injustice and wage gaps and things like that. And it's just kind of not known yet.
Great, thanks. Someone asked a question, Judith asked a question about that there are any number of new terms with slightly new definitions, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma, and others. What meaning do you give to the need for these fairly new terms? And do you see them offering new opportunities to make sense of burnout?
Yeah, that's a good question. Compassion fatigue, look, that's something that like nurses and counselors often talk about. And as I understand, so like some of these terms I think have a fairly precise meaning in research and clinical discussion, and others don't. So like compassion fatigue is one that has I think a fairly precise definition. And I think it's something that is not seen as quite as chronic as burnout is. And a term like moral injury, for instance, is one that is gaining some traction among physicians, but it's not well defined in, to use a very, technical nerdy term, it's not like operationalized in a really clear way in research on this yet. So I want to hold off on talking a lot about moral injury, partly because I think that when physicians, in what I've read, when physicians who talk about moral injury do so, what they're describing sounds a lot like burnout. And I think if we had a really good definition of burnouts, then we might not need the definition of moral injury. This is, something to hash out in academic articles, over the coming decades, and I hope that researchers will do that. But yeah, I mean, it's I'm all for more precise definitions of everything, because then they're just more useful for us. Right.
Great. So there's a question about do you think that desire for fulfillment is the main driver of burnout? She wrote that, I know plenty of people who aren't seeking fulfillment from work and still feel burnt out. And what's your perspective on how the culture of productivity and consumerism contributes to this, leads to burnout? And what could we as individuals and communities do about this culture of we must do more, earn more, produce more, have more, get more?
Yeah, so I really appreciate the end of that question about what can we do as communities, because if the causes of burnout are shared, then the answer has to be shared too, and it has to be in compassionate communities, I would say, compassionate communities at work and beyond work. So for instance, yeah, I mean, it's not just fulfillment, but it's also seeking dignity at work. People, one thing that motivates us to work is to be honored in our community. And people feel a great deal of shame when they are out of work as a result of that. And so on a communal level, I would say, well, what if we just recognize people's dignity regardless of their work? How transformative could that be to lower the stakes somewhat on work? And then I would hope that, we could say, oh, well, once you do go to work, because we've already recognized you as a dignified human being, then let's make sure that you have conditions at work that live up to that dignity. But we do have a role, and yeah, the questioner also asked about consumerism. I think that we have a role as consumers in like burnout is not only a workplace problem, it's also a problem of what we demand of workers as consumers, as patients, as students, as congregants, perhaps, as passengers.
Never.
As as passengers on airlines or subway or whatever, because yeah, and I think that we can lose sight of what we're demanding and our expectation of, I was going to say, our expectation of instant delivery of everything. And just to be clear, I expect instant delivery of everything. Like, I'm every bit as guilty as anyone. But I think that we could stand to step back and say, well, hold on. That convenience is coming at the cost of someone else. Granted, it's their job. They probably want to make the money, but perhaps their job would be better if they were making that same amount, but it was a bit less demanding. So yeah, it's right. It's not just about our expectations of our own work, but what we expect of others whose work serves us.
Right. So if you could go back in time and speak to your burned out self.
Oh no.
What would you say? And because Sandy asked about, like, is the only option to quit? Like, how would you coach yourself now, given what you've learned? And yeah, what would you say to yourself 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think that the big thing, it'd be something like, well, one thing I would say would be get over yourself. Because I do think that, pride played some role in me believing that I could do all this stuff at the college, that I could be a great teacher, and I could direct the teaching center, and I could be, a recognized researcher, and I could, head up this committee. And, that wasn't true. I couldn't do those things. And I do sometimes wonder if there was an answer short of quitting. And it would be interesting to kind of roll back the tape and, make some changes there. Because, right, like, quitting is not a great option for most people. I was in the fortunate position of having a job where I had a pretty good amount of autonomy that I used to take on more responsibilities, and convince myself that I was indispensable. I could have, what it comes down to is I could have done less. I could have done so much less, and still, not only kept my job, but probably excelled in, a couple areas. So I guess, like, the lesson to take from that is that, if you are, feeling burnout, like, something about your job has to change. It can't be just, a change in mindset, though that might be part of it. Like, something about your responsibilities, something about your conditions will need to change. Maybe it means just shifting positions within the same organization. That might do the trick. But yeah, you have to have possibly, difficult conversations with supervisors, coworkers, clients, and so on. But right, I mean, otherwise you're just, you're doing the same thing, expecting different results. And like, yeah, I guess that you got to find that place where you do have some possibility for change.
Right. Someone asked about do you have to be working? Like, is burnout only a work thing? And I mean, you touch in your book also about parenting a little bit, and that it's not the same because it's not paid, even though. But can you, and also unemployment is also a big reality, a big reality, and unemployment, retirement, parenting, being a student, the pressures that we are hearing a lot from our teenagers, in particular college students who aren't working but are going to school and feeling, and the societal pressures of producing in certain ways. So how do you think about that, the differences between those roles that people play in their lives, and how burnout functions similarly or differently?
Yeah. Researchers are, to me, like a really interesting area of research is parental burnout. That researchers have developed a scale for measuring parental burnout, similar to the 3 dimensions of occupational burnout. There are studies of student burnout, not quite as many, but yeah, I mean, these are areas that are like work in some ways, like you say, but not in others. And the aspects of them are the fact that they are a bit like work, or sometimes a lot like work, is what kind of opens them up to the burnout conversation, opens them up to being studied the way occupational burnout is. But at the same time, I think that our viewing those other areas of life, parenting, relationships, school, we talk about mental health as work. We sometimes even talk about dying as work. And I think that, there's so many disanalogies between work and all of those activities. And I think that by viewing them primarily, by focusing on the aspect of them that are like work, we're missing the full reality of them. And I think that we're showing a kind of lack of moral imagination and an unwillingness. And it also shows just how out of proportion the value that we place on work is. Well, what justifies the effort that it takes to go to school? Well, it's like work. Why is parenting so important? Well, because how do we signal that parenting is important? We describe it as work. But yeah, there are those disanalogies, and they aim at different ends. They have different goals than a job does. A good marriage is not necessarily one that is productive in a job sense. Schooling is not valuable solely for economic reasons, and parenting likewise. These things do take effort, but they aim at different things than a job does. And so I would like to see us culturally develop a richer vocabulary for talking about the value of all these other human activities without reducing them to work, while recognizing that they are difficult. But not everything that's difficult is work. It's difficult to, I don't know, I mean, all kinds of things are difficult, and it's not the difficult. I guess this is the thing. Sorry, this is a rambly answer, but this is the point. Like, it's not the difficulty alone that justifies them. parenting isn't a good thing to do because it's difficult. If it were easy, it would be just as valuable. Math is not a good thing to do because it's difficult. For some people, math is easy and it's just as valuable as a result. And so the difficulty is often a component, but that's not the reason it's good. And I want us to be able to make these distinctions.
Great. So I have 2 more questions. I'm going to let people know that the rest of the questions that were sent to me were, unfortunately, we won't have time to get answered. But so I wanted to ask, did anything surprise you about what you've studied or learned? Like, what's been the most surprising thing in your research or your lived experience around this question?
Yeah. In the research, 2 of the more surprising things are things that we've already talked about. So one is the relationship between burnout and age. I have more sympathy for younger, for the younger, for the generations younger than me now, recognizing, okay, well, maybe they're not just, whining or something like that. Like they have legitimate complaints. That was one thing. And also the history of burnout, the fact that it was this really interesting simultaneous discovery, I think because there was something in the air at that time in the 1970s and I think we're still in basically we're in the economic era and the work culture that was being made in the 1970s. I think that, for all the technological change, the fundamental assumptions about work are pretty similar. In my own experience, a pleasant surprise is that there's hope. There's a way past burnout. In my case, it took a pretty radical career change. And I don't think that it has to be that radical for everyone. I certainly hope not. But yeah, I mean, I got over burnout. I got past it. And, I've found a new career. Burnout doesn't have to be the end. And I hope that that's encouraging for people.
Wonderful. I think so. So the last thing I wanted to ask, and it's a little bit of a combo question to end, is you used the compound word, moral imagination. And I think I've been speaking a lot about that this year. The Shemitah year is about having an imagination about something different, what could be as opposed to what is. And what's your prayer around work for our culture? Like you study theology, your book is grounded, I think, also in a notion of an ethic and dignity and morality. And I presume some, faith in that space. And what is in what you imagine could be, what is your prayer for our society around the meaning of work?
Yeah, I think it would have to be some kind of prayer. See, this is, like my first impulse is to kind of pray. Well, I want to pray that other people start, doing the right thing. And that's probably not, it's probably not where we should start with our prayer. It should probably be a recognition of, my own shortcomings first. And yeah, I mean, I think it'd be a prayer to, to recognize the dignity that each one of us has, regardless of our work status. And I guess that cuts in 2 directions. It would be a prayer to recognize that, the person who delivered a package to my door, like right before I got on this call, has, an inherent human dignity, inherent and irreducible human dignity. And they deserve to have that recognized at work. And I need to recognize that too. The other way I think that cuts is to pray to recognize that I don't get my dignity from my work. I get my dignity by being a creature of God. And if I truly recognize that in myself, then I might start to question, well, wait, why am I taking on this extra thing when, I don't really need the money. It might bring me status or something. Why am I chasing some of these things that I don't entirely need? So yeah, I guess it would be that a prayer to see to see each other and ourselves as dignified creatures, and that our work neither improves on that nor erases it.
Amen. So thank you. We want to really thank Jonathan for being with us tonight. And I just want to encourage everyone to read the book. I think it speaks to many of the things Jonathan spoke about this evening, but it has a lot more to say. And I think as part of what we're trying to do this year is to really cultivate the conversation, that we can operate in our existence on autopilot. And part of what the Shemitah year does is to disrupt our normative ways of operating and thinking, and to ask different kinds of questions and look into, be willing to look into the belly of the beast in a lot of ways. And I also just want to make the invitation, I think, in Jewish space, in Jewish time, there's an inherent value put in work. There's a lot of discussion in our tradition about the nature of work, but the Sabbath is the disruptor of that orientation of productivity. And that's not only for the self, it's for the land, it's for those we employ, in biblical language, for the slaves, that we have a practice of moving away from work as the vehicle for dignity in our tradition, and all the kind of fences around protecting that 25-hour time of Shabbat is the vehicle to disentangle ourselves from that, the martyrdom of living in a work centric existence, and to be in a God-centric existence, which is also to recognize that we're creatures of God. And so I just want to offer that up as a way to think about this question, and how we learn also to put limits, that the tradition gives us functional ways to actually put limits on it, which is not the whole answer. It's not a cultural answer, but it is a way to start thinking about our attachment. I hope that we'll be able to continue this conversation in many ways, individually and collectively, and think about a lot of what we would call Torah, the teaching and wisdom of Jonathan this evening, that certainly has been stirring in my heart and soul for the last number of weeks as I've been in the thinking of your book. So thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you to everyone for being here tonight. And tomorrow morning, there's morning minyan at 8:00. Anyone who wants to come join for that. And there's will be a number of new things coming out. There's a number of things to prepare for Pesach. Tomorrow night, there's a teaching with Rabbi Mike Moskowitz, preparing for Passover, amongst many other things coming up in the coming week. Have a good night, everyone. And thanks so much again, Jonathan.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. Thanks for all the questions.
Have a good night, everyone.